Why socialism doesn't work, the left gets lefter, and while we're at it, we'll talk about the children. I'm Will Inman, and this is High in the Hills. Hey guys, thanks for being here with me today. As I mentioned at the top, the first thing I want to get into is socialism and why it's a relevant conversation in 2019 in the greatest country in the world, America. I'm just as confused as 7-year-old Billy with polio as to why he can't go outside and play with his friends on this issue, but we'll get into it. First off, for those who were sitting in the back of the class, or were dead, or truant, or stoned, I don't know what your fourth grade situation was, but whatever it is, just kind of recap here. Socialism is basically a state-controlled system, an economic system of redistribution. So where the state would control everything from medicine and healthcare to factories to grocery stores. I mean, it's really locked in by the state, ultimately giving the government a huge amount of control over so many factors in our lives that we typically take for granted here. So we'll get into that a little bit more and to why it eats dicks. But now, before we get off in the weeds too far on that, just real quick, the people who are pulling for socialism, the people who are actively rallying behind socialism making its way into America these days are failed capitalists. It's not the business owner. It's not the guy who started from nothing and now makes, $85K a year. It's not those people. It's not the lady who put herself through nursing school to become an RN. It's not her. It's these kids, well, primarily kids, but it does extend to older folks as well in some cases, like Bernie Sanders, for example. But it's the notion that because we exist, we're owed. Which, as somebody who works, that's horseshit logic. I mean, it's flawed on every level. And again, I'm not a dick. I don't want you to do without things. I'm not rallying for anybody to have a hard time. But at the end of the day, you got to have more people pulling the wagon than you do people sitting on it, or you're obviously headed towards a bad situation. But real quick examples of things that matter to us that you would lose almost immediately in a socialist system. Basic selection of things. The reason why you have the option between the Explorer, the Navigator, whatever else that you may want these days, car-wise or anything else, is because of capitalism. Otherwise, everybody would have a choice of one car, one truck, one SUV. If you're lucky, it would all be state mandated. And if the government, if the government makes vehicles the same way that they do everything else, then that's, I don't want to be on the other end of that. Another thing, the reason why you're not eating fucking Stadios every morning for breakfast is because of capitalism. People make those choices. People invest. People get into endeavors. People risk in order to potentially reap rewards. And that's the incentive of being a driven person in a capitalist economic system, is you can risk big and you can also be rewarded bigly. But at the end of the day, it's somehow this income inequality issue with the left has trumped common sense. And for some reason, their lack of success constitutes that it's okay for them to steal. So again, through capitalism and redistribution, it doesn't make it right just because the majority pulled on it. For example, if me and 3 guys go out and hanging out, whatever else, and at some point in the night, those 3 guys take a vote and decide to rape me, is that fair just because it's majority rules voting? No, absolutely not. And besides, it would be consensual. Getting off of that, going to something else entirely, we fought this. We fought socialism because we saw the potential radicalism within the idea itself. Again, in order to be on board with socialism and stand behind what it represents, you have to believe that it's okay for me to take what you've earned or vice versa. And again, Doesn't hit you too hard if you're a shitbag living at your mom's, living in your mom's basement at 37 and not making any kind of money. But if you're somebody who has actually got out here, participated in capitalism and been successful in it, then why the hell would that person owe the 37-year-old who lives in his mother's basement anything? The premise is contradictory to me fair and freedom. And again, if the people who are seeking seeking to bring socialism into America are the same people who are rallying for freedoms, whether it be freedom to infanticide or freedom to turn into the opposite sex or make up your own sex or gender and become that. So you're rallying for these freedoms. Look at socialist systems in the past. How many socialist systems in the past allow one to exercise that kind of freedom? That kind of frivolous freedom. And another thing, and I know I'm just kind of getting off point here, but another thing that really rips at socialism is this envious culture that we've built. You can't be envious of everything someone has, someone who's put in hard work to have things, and then think socialism is going to tilt that scale in your favor to where you guys are 50-50. And again, that goes right back to the income inequality thing with the left. So, just in short, socialism, something's a bit fucky with the whole system. And if you don't see it, you're probably on the wrong side. But, not here to change anybody's mind. Do your research. Make your own call. Give me a minute to get myself together here, and we'll be right back to talk more. Will Inman, and this is High in the Hills. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for staying around. Like I mentioned at the top, another thing that I wanted to touch on today is the left is getting lefter. Now, you'll have some that deny that, but overall, the general consensus from those who don't belong to the far left, generally they'll agree that the left is getting lefter. I have a perfect example of that. But before we get into it, I always like to frame this a little bit. Because if not, it's very, very easy to spin off into an emotional discussion based on feelings and things like that that are completely not related to policy, which is fine if you want to have that as a separate conversation. You can get into the morals of it, at which point in time, obviously, it gets a little deeper. But the first question that I kind of frame this with is how much do you value the sovereignty of this nation? Just overall, the general safety and well-being of the country that you live in, the country that has given you so many liberties and freedoms, etc., and opportunities, things like that, choices, whatever. And the second question that I like to frame this with is, what is the benefit of illegal immigration into our country, to our country, rather? And again, that's a very difficult question to ask without it being spun off into something emotional, some kind of emotional response that's completely untethered. But again, with those two questions in mind, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has recently issued a statement saying that basically they will not cooperate with ICE in the deportation of these illegal immigrants, whether they're criminal once they came into America, I don't want to say became Americans, or whether their only crime was crossing into the border illegal, which, as it turns out, is a pretty big one. Go ahead and cross the border into another country without any kind of clearance prior to doing so, and see what kind of treatment that you'll receive. Because I think you'll be surprised at just how good this terrible, awful country that you hate so bad, America, looks in the rearview mirror. That's all I'll say on the subject. Please, if anybody has an answer that, again, doesn't get into emotional bloviating about people being in cages due to underfunding, like based on Democrats, if you really have a legitimate point that you feel is relevant as to what the benefit to America of illegal immigration is, I'm all ears. But when the questions are actually posed, you seldomly get an answer and almost never get a fact-based answer or a relevant answer. You immediately get into the moral ground of it to where you can follow it a couple of different paths. In my experience, you can have this conversation with leftists in a couple of different ways, but it always comes out to their hidden point of, don't separate children from criminals who are held in custody. But what do you think happens in any situation? What do you think happens if I'm driving with my child and have me a nice Milwaukee's Best sitting on the dashboard, and Officer Johnson decides to pull me over and take my ass to jail? Then guess where my child goes? They don't lock him up with me. They don't have a conversion cuff that's like an adult size on one side and then converts down to a smaller size on the other side. It doesn't work. It's not a thing that happens. That child, best case scenario, goes home to family. Worst case scenario is put into some kind of public custody, some kind of foster care, state care, whatever it is. I don't have a lot of DUIs with children in the car, so I don't have a lot of experience to reflect on there. But the irony is just overwhelming. It's just a punch in the face when you think about that. If you're caught committing a crime such as, illegally entering a country, and you happen to have from what you tell that country is your child with you, what should we do? Do we pat that kid on the back and tell him where the bus station is and a place where he can find a warm meal? No, you don't do that. Do you lock him up in a cage? No, Democrats don't like that either, even though it was an Obama policy. Ultimately, what it boils down to is a catch and release. They want a catch and release, 100%. Caught at the border, booked, given a court date, released into the general population of America, at which point in time, roughly 67% of illegal immigrants don't show up for that court date and are therefore not naturally subjected to the immigration process. So what is the deterrent based on what Democrats believe for entering this country? No, it's a legitimate question. What is the deterrent? I mean, if we're basically, looking at it from a Democratic point of view, from a Democrat point of view, we're basically looking to cultivate a path to citizenship right out of the gate. And that's great. If you come here, assimilate, and contribute. If you come here and do the opposite of that, I'll avoid stereotypes for now. But if you come in and you do the opposite of that, then how do you benefit us? It's like working for a company. If you're no longer beneficial to a company, then what do you think they're going to do? They're going to toss your ass out like yesterday's garbage and not give it a second thought, and oftentimes rightfully so. So I know what's coming here. I'm very familiar with the process. Before you start calling me a racist or a bigot or whatever else is trendy, I just ask that you do some research, that you consider some factual information, and reach your own conclusion. But again, I'm not here to change anyone's mind. Give me another moment to get myself back together, and we'll be here to wrap up. High in the hills, this is Will Inman. Please, someone think of the children. As it turns out, the children are actually doing okay. According to a report by Forbes magazine, Generation Z, the generation following millennials, born around mid to late 90s, 95, 97, somewhere in that neighborhood, they are already both more socially as well as fiscally conservative than millennials, the previous generation. Why, you ask? It's as if they can observe the behavior of their parents and other people in that age range, and they're repulsed by it. It's like if you grew up in a home with two crackheads as parents, you probably have a one of two outcome there. You're either going to be, the guy who's like, fuck it, this is me. This is my surroundings. This is who I am. I'm going to smoke me a little crack. And whatever. I've never tried it personally, but I've never heard anything negative about it. So if you're one to give up that easy, smoke you a pipe. Might be great. Or option two, and this Generation Z may be looking at the previous generation, really fucked up ideology in there. And it's one of those two things, or it could be something completely unrelated. So again, just kind of my thoughts on the process. But overall, anytime you have a next generation of children coming up in the world, some of these are not children anymore. Some of them were, in their early 20s. But anytime that you see a more conservative flow of people entering, a conservative demographic entering politics, it tends to bode very well. And again, nobody's 100% perfect on the right, but especially on the left. If anything, if we could get back to where we had a common set of values in this country, where we were pulling in the same direction, I think that's all we need. I mean, we're resilient. We have a tendency to make it through things and come out the other side stronger in this country. It's kind of what this country was founded upon. And it really sucks to see people pulling away from that. But again, hopes are high as the hills for this next generation. I appreciate you guys tuning in for the first go round here, and I look forward to having you back. Anything you would like me to kind of touch on in the future, if you would like to discuss it, whatever else, love to hear from you. High in the hills, this is Will Inman. Have a great day.